Good evening and welcome to our weekly book study here at the New Covenant House. New Covenant House is, as you know, is an income-sharing Christian intentional community in the Catskills region of New York. And last week we are reading the book called Christian Anarchism by Alexandre Christoyannopoulos. And last week we started a little mini-series on the state. And last week we kind of got the definition of what a state is, and saw that in addition to the word state, government, power, and authority are also words that are being used in that context. So, and we kind of like dug into a little bit about what they mean. Tonight, we're going to be talking about the one aspect of the state that's violence. When we were in chapter 1, the chapter about the Sermon on the Mount, we talked a lot about not to resist evil. And at that time, we saw that the Christian Anarchists consider the state to be inherently violent. And that happens in a number of ways. War is just one of them. But it is the most significant one. But it also more on an individual level, even its own citizens experience violence from the state. Tolstoy is the one who is most verbal about this stuff. And it's kind of not really that surprising because he lived in a very he was one of the privileged class, but he lived in an environment where people were still serfs, which is kind of like just another term for slavery in so many ways. But what he's saying is that he's saying that the state is inherently violent. He says there's some degree of violence or compulsion will always be required to carry out any state activity. And the state activity he's talking about is the idea that about the democracy where we have 51 can lord it over 49. Legislation is organized violence, he calls it. And the opposite of that is, he disagrees with that, is that the legislation is the expression of the will of the people. That's the view that most people in this country have now, but Tolstoy doesn't see it that way at all. He sees legislation as oppressive for some people who disagree with the majority is deciding. But there's also the other possibility that a few people can lord it over the many, as in if you have absolute monarchy, one person can lord it over everybody else. An oligarchy is a small number of people with all the power who can lord it over everyone else. For Tolstoy, legislation merely expresses the will of those in power, obedience to which can only be achieved by the threat of violent punishment. So it's not really connected to the number of people who have the power, but the power itself. And when you try to get people to do what they don't want to do, you have to have some sort of way to enforce the laws that you want them to follow. So, and And you can do that either by actually punishing people or threaten them to be punished. Laws are rules made by people who govern by means of organized violence for non-compliance, with which the non-complier is subjected to blows, to loss of liberty, or even to being murdered. So those are the tools that the state has to get people to comply with their laws, the human-made laws. Tolstoy is therefore adamant that legislation amounts to slavery. Moreover, by definition, no legislative fix can truly eradicate this slavery. Only the abolition of human laws can. So the only way to get around this is to stop making human laws. I listened to a podcast a few days ago about how you describe your intentional community, and the tendency is to simply describe in very broad terms, and maybe even to this extent of you define your values and expect everybody else to follow those values, to have the same value. If they have the same values, then they should behave in accordance with these values. But that's not according to this intentional community expert. You need to really go down and talk and describe in very minute detail what it is like to live in your intentional community. You can't just be very broad. But so it's a little bit like a controlling. You have to be controlling in some ways. But that's what Tolstoy means about this. So another thing that that happens with the state is that scientific progress makes things worse, according to Tolstoy. Every victory over nature will inevitably serve only to increase the government's minority's power over and oppression of the majority. He refers to a fellow named Herzen's remark that governments have become Genghis Khans with telegraphs. I'm not sure exactly what he means by that, but we don't have telegraphs anymore. But we have all kinds of other electronic gadgets. His Pentecost is another one of these anarchist writers. He uses an example of that, and he refers to the electric chair, which made it possible to avoid the uncomfortable spectacle of sickening contortions and unpleasant mishaps that accompany the more traditional hangings of criminals. So it was uncomfortable for people to see people taking a while to die when they were being hanged. And I can add to that a story from Danish history where beheadings was a form of execution, and the last one went terribly wrong, and it must have been a very messy and very scary experience for those who were watching, because it was a public event. But enough about that. Scientific and technical progress has thus served the governing minority by extending the range of options available to violently oppress the masses. And that is going to be the next point, that the messiness of an execution, of a beheading, is obviously very intrusive, very obvious. So the state is using technology to make this more subtle, more hidden. And one of the ways they do that is to make it into a more complex machine. And we have probably all experienced the bureaucracy we can run into in the state apparatus. Makes the machine becomes less obvious and more obscure. And that's more about what the next section next week is going to be about, the deception of the state. Tolstoy says that the state is a terrible machine of power. And he talks about, anarchists are predominantly pacifists, but in the minds of people, anarchists are violent and somehow the state has made it turn it into that you need to be afraid of anarchists because they are so violent, which they are not. While the state itself kind of has this subtle violence built into it. So Hennessy is one of the people who say that. As Hennessy also remarks, even though some anarchists are bomb throwers and killers, the biggest bomb thrower is the government. So he says that this is so. So if you see it any other way, you are deceiving yourself, says the Christian Anarchists. Okay, so that was a little bit about the violence in that's built into the state concept. Next week we're going to dig deeper into this idea that they're hiding it for you and deceiving your, and kind of like pulling the wool over your eyes. It's a little bit of a lengthy story, but we will see next week. Thank you for coming. I appreciate your being here, like every week. And